Hnrs, welcome back to your flipped classroom and our not continuing discussion actually, because we're starting a new topic, right? We are now moving into our new unit, right? We are starting our new unit on our very first Western civilization. Now, I know some of y'all are probably thinking to yourself right now, like, well, what have we been talking about this entire time then? Well, the thing about it, though, is that you gotta understand that that first unit is actually about, like, kind of the foundational ancient civilizations, right? We took a lot of time to talk about, like, the Egyptians in a very, very grand scheme sense. We talked about the Mesopotamians and the Phoenicians and the Assyrians and all of these other people that kind of defined the idea of the dawn of civilizations, right? They were simple people that came before the split, the ideological split between what you would consider Eastern civilizations and Western civilizations. There are foundational pieces. The places that simply just had these 6 characteristics: concentration, complex religion, political and military structure, social classes, writing, art, and intellectual activity. But of course, you already know that because you've learned that stuff already, right? But we are now moving into our topic about our first Westerners, right? This thing that grew out of the Mediterranean Sea and began the concept or the conceptual idea of Western civilizations in general. And I know for a fact a lot of y'all are probably pretty pumped to talk about ancient Greece. For any of those of you that are not pretty pumped, boo! You're boring. Now, the big thing about it, though, in general is don't be a fun ruiner and enjoy this. This is a really, really exciting unit because a lot of y'all know a ton of stuff probably about ancient Greeks already, right? Some of you probably know what the name of this building is. By the way, it's called the Parthenon, right? So, for example, like some people actually might actually know that. There's actually a fun fact, a full-scale model of this building that is actually atop of the Acropolis of Athens in Greece in the modern era. There's a full-scale model of the Parthenon that I will actually be seeing in December in Nashville, Tennessee. Weirdly enough. Now, anyway, so the big thing about it, though, don't ask me why it's there, but it just is. So the thing about it, though, is you might have actually seen this building, and a lot of you might actually understand as well, in the grand scheme of things, the ancient Greeks have left a massive amount, a huge amount of cultural, historical, and also mythological impacts on the actual modern-day era, right? You're walking around, you're reading books like when you were younger, Percy Jackson, right? Named after Perseus, the actual famous Greek hero. And it has elements of the Iliad, the Odyssey, and mythological characters originally documented and created by this guy named Hesiod during the Greek Dark Ages, right? We'll talk about that stuff. If you actually ever go to D.C. and go see the White House or the Lincoln Memorial, those 2 buildings are designed based off of the Western-style columns and pediment style of the Parthenon building as well. If you ever actually get a chance to go check those things out, you definitely should. The ancient Greeks have left a ton of lingering impacts that still affect us in a very, very large scheme. But a big thing that a lot of y'all have to understand when you're talking about ancient Greece is a lot of y'all don't seem to know where it is, all right? So, like, let's start there, okay? Let's see if some of y'all can actually gather in a little bit and see if you can actually figure out where it is. Well, if we're going to start off this discussion just by kind of figuring out where ancient Greece is, by the way, your next quiz is going to be a map quiz where we're going to talk about where all the modern-day countries that surround ancient Greece, and I'm going to be posting that practice map after I make this flip and stuff, and then you're going to have it before I leave on, like, next week. Blah. Yeah, exactly, right? You're going to have a map quiz. And I'll actually post the thing. It's a little game on Google Classroom. You can totally practice it there, right? But the big thing about it is, let's go ahead and zero in on this. What we know if we're talking about Western civilizations, who remembers the actual sea that they popped up out of? Oh, Mr. Terry, I know this one. Yes, me from the past. Well, that is exactly right. It's the Mediterranean, right? So we got to zoom in a little bit on where the Mediterranean is. Well, we know it's in the Eastern Hemisphere. Well, the Mediterranean Sea is right there, right? The actual sea that conjoins Northern Africa to Southern Europe, right? Well, the thing about it is, let's get a nicer picture in there because that's all pixelated and a little bit gross. So looking at the continent of Europe, okay, I'll give you a little bit of a hint. Greece is on the continent of Europe, okay? Well, do any of you know where Greece is in the modern day sense and also where it will be located in the ancient sense as well? I'm not going to play that whole song. The big thing about it, though, is for any of you that said here, you're wrong. That's Italy, all right? So I know some of you are like, I did say that. Well, no, actually, it's located right there, okay? This right here is what you would know as modern-day Greece, okay? Now, modern-day Greece, of course, is very, very close to actually where Italy is located. In our next unit, we'll be talking about the Romans, which is very, very exciting because that's my unit. I don't think you understand. These 2 units coming up, ancient Greece and ancient Rome, are 2 of my favorite things to teach about, favorite things to talk about. But the big thing you always have to start off talking about between, like, Greece and Italy is you actually have to talk about how their geographies are almost exactly opposite of each other. So looking into it, we have to start our entire discussion about ancient Greece with their geography. But wait, there's something we got to talk about first, okay? So just so you understand, let's get a general overview of Greece in general. We'll do the same thing when we talk about Rome as well. We did this when we talked about ancient Egypt. Mm. You have to understand how to track the progression of history using linear time, right? So when we're talking about tracking the progression of history using linear time, before we can ever talk about the geography of ancient Greece and how it's going to affect their culture, we have to talk about their time periods, right? So just as an overview, so you know, there are actually a lot like ancient Egypt, 8 Greek time periods. Now I know there's only 7 in ancient Egypt. There was the Archaic period, the Old Kingdom, the New First Intermediate, Middle Kingdom, Second Intermediate, like New Kingdom, Third Intermediate. But now we're going to have 8 distinct Greek time periods, ranging from 7,000 BC to about 33 BC, right? Give or take. Now, the interesting thing about that 33 BC context is actually going to be when the Romans show up and take them over, okay? Well, look, going into it, though, just so you understand, the 8 Greek time periods are going to be massively, massively, massively important, all right? And they all are very intensely named, okay? So the big thing about it that I like to always start off with this part of the unit, okay, is talking about a fun little story from when I was actually teaching up in New Jersey, okay? So every single one of the Greek time periods start off with these letters, okay? Not every single one of them. That's ridiculous, all right? So, like, the Greek time periods start off with these letters. The first one starts with an N. The first one starts with an E and a B, then an M, then an M, then a D, then an A, then a CH. Now, some of y'all are probably going to try and come up with little ways to remember these things, right? Some of y'all are going to be like, Nemdatch, all right? So, like, that's fine if you want to do it that way, but I'm going to give y'all a little cool way to remember the first letters of all the Greek time periods. So when you go to your test and you get to them in the fill-in-the-blank section, and on your test for ancient Greece, you're going to have to write all of them down in order and then actually be able to describe them a little bit as well. The thing about it, though, is that you have to understand, I used to teach this one kid named Dylan. Now, Dylan was a funny kid. He was very, very goofy and stuff like that. He used to jump up and down on my desk every now and again. And one day I look over and Dylan, like, he pulled out a giant handful of Legos out of his pocket, right? And he's just sitting there messing with them and playing around and stuff like that. And I looked at him and I was like, Dylan, I tell you what, I'll make you a bet. If you can tell me every single one of the 8 Greek time periods in order right now without looking at your notes or without looking at any materials from your classmates, I'll let you keep playing with those Legos, right? No, and no lie, man showed up and he proved me wrong, right? And he goes, Neolithic, Early Bronze, Minoan, Mycenaean, Dark Age, Archaic, Classical, Hellenistic. And he just spits them out, right? He just spits them out almost immediately. And I was like, whoa, Dylan, how the heck did you remember that so well as a 9th grader, right? Like, because I used to actually teach Western civilization to 9th graders. And so the thing about it is he goes, oh, well, I came up with like a little way to remember it. And I say, Nathan eats bacon. Okay, EB is eats bacon. He would always go, Nathan eats bacon. Meanwhile, mommy dances at Charlie's house, which I know is a very weird thing to say. Nathan eats bacon, meanwhile mommy dances at Charlie's house. It's a very strange mnemonic device, but the kid used it and it worked, and I swear on everything holy, kids remember it for the rest of their, like, for forever, all right? Like, literally, I'm gonna stop, like, saying words right now, and I bet for, like, you can say that mnemonic back to yourself. Exactly, right? Nathan eats bacon, meanwhile mommy dances at Charlie's house. All right, so, like, it literally just works, which sounds like a sad boy is eating bacon at home while his mom's out dancing, apparently. But the big thing about it, though, in general, is that you have to understand is those are the first letters of all the 8 Greek time periods, okay? And what they're actually called is the Neolithic period, the Early Bronze period, the Minoan period, the Mycenaean period, the Dark Ages period, the Archaic period, Classical period, and the Hellenistic period. So really, really quickly, that's all 8 Greek time periods. But when you actually get to your test, you can use that mnemonic device to just kind of keep them all in order. And then also, we're going to heavily review those time periods all the time, real quickly, all the time. Like, in class, I'll randomly be like, give me the first 4, give me the second 4, give me the second and the third, give me the first, blah, 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 and we'll drill it a lot. So using that little mnemonic device in the back of your head can definitely help you out when it comes to just placing them where they are in time, right? You'll be going, Nathan eats bacon, meanwhile mommy dances at. So, like, now look, big thing about it, though, is go ahead and hit pause on the screen real fast and just go ahead and write these things down. But this is what starts out your notes for the ancient Greek time periods, right? Or the ancient Greek stuff that we're about to talk about in general. Because we're going to be talking about the Neolithic period, the Early Bronze period, and possibly a little bit of the Minoan period during this flip itself, okay? So go ahead and hit pause. Very nice. All right, good job. Okay, so the Neolithic period, Early Bronze period, Minoan, Mycenaean, Dark Ages, Archaic, Classical, Hellenistic. Nathan eats bacon, meanwhile mommy dances Charlie house. Now look, getting into it though, now we can move into that Greek geography, right? So we're now going to be going into our discussion about Greece and how the geographical components of this area are going to contribute significantly to the growth of their culture and then also leave lingering impacts on the development of them as a civilization, all right? I know that's a mouthful, but you can do this, okay? So the big thing about it, though, to start off with, is let's go ahead and take a gander at this map of Greece. Now, some of y'all are like, Mr. Terry, that doesn't look like a map of Greece. That looks like a hurricane. I know it does. It does actually look kind of like a storm map and stuff like that, but it's actually not. This is what's known as a topographical map, right? And a topographical map actually measures elevation, okay? So the thing about it is everything you see in orange and red actually means that it's elevated much, much higher and that of a mountain range. So the first thing that you notice almost immediately about Greece's geography is that it is extremely mountainous. It is covered in mountains, okay? Now, the thing about it, though, is that's also going to lead to the development of something very unique. The Greeks, when they develop, are not going to be like the Egyptians. Ironically enough, the Romans are going to be a lot more like the Egyptians and have a centralized kingdom that eventually radiates out into an empire, whereas the Greeks were much more comparable to the Mesopotamians. Ironically enough, the Greeks are the reason why we call Mesopotamians because they came into contact with them, right? And they called the Mesopotamians because the Mesopotamians were the land between two rivers, right? Same thing too with the Phoenicians. They also gave them a name as well, but we'll get to all that stuff, that overlap stuff, here in about 2 seconds. Well, looking at the entire expansiveness about Greece and Mesopotamia being similar culturally, it also has to do with this idea of the mountains actually cutting off the earliest settlements in ancient Greece. So whenever Greece starts actually forming city-states, now there's going to be a ton of city-states in ancient Greece. Greece is much more of a region, like Mesopotamia was a region. When we talked about Mesopotamia, we talked about the uprising of a lot of different distinct city-states in Mesopotamia and how there was never really truly a centralized government between all of them, right? We talked about Babylon, we talked about Acadia, we talked about Assyria, we talked about the Hebrews, we talked about we talked about Sumer, like all these different areas and locations, right? Well, the thing about it getting into it that you need to understand is the Greeks are a lot like that. Now, one catch-all, though, that you need to understand, they're going to be a little different from the Mesopotamians, though, because their cultures are going to be a little bit different from one another. They all end up speaking the same language and using the same writing systems and stuff due to cultural diffusion a little bit later on in their development culturally. But what's going to happen because of these mountains and the mountainous terrain of ancient Greece is it makes the land very, very rugged and hard to navigate. And so, as settlements began to pop up in ancient Greece, their cultures are going to be wildly different from one another. The best comparison that you can use as an example of these two things is that of Athens and Sparta, all right? So we'll talk about them during the Archaic period and after the Bronze Age collapse, but the big thing about it is looking forward into the future, geographic isolationism is going to lead to multiple different city-states and very unique cultures. Spartans were all about war and the destruction of anything that came in their way and all this other stuff, and they were literally all about military tradition and oligarchical government, whereas the Athenians were all about democracy and art and philosophy and terribly treating women. I'm not even going to lie to you. Like, women's rights in Athens were abysmal. Ironically enough, you had more rights as a woman living in the military oligarchy that Sparta had, because 30% of all land in Sparta was owned by women, which is bananas. So like now, for an ancient society anyway, right? So the big thing about it that we need to understand is that geographic isolationism, this mountains, is going to play a heavy impact in the creation of these different cultures, right? So going forward as well, something else you need to understand that's significantly different from Greece than that of Mesopotamia or Egypt is that their farmland is not very good. If you actually go to Greece today, only 45% of their land is farmable in the modern era. And a lot of that has to do with modern agricultural techniques and also modern landscape architecture, right? Well, the thing about it is, though, is to the ancient Greeks, none of these like modern tools and none of this architecture and none of this like earth moving was possible, right? So the funny thing about it is that in ancient Greece, if you were looking for somewhere to settle, it wasn't the best place to go if you're talking about doing a lot of farming, because only 20% of the land in ancient Greece was farmable. And it was mostly reserved in this western area of Greece where there were flat plains and areas that they could actually like afford to farm in a sense. Now, they could herd animals. This is something that's important that you're going to need to know a little bit later. The Greeks were able to herd things like goats and also some small herd animals and stuff like that, which is actually going to leave a lingering impact on their cuisine, right? Which is why there's a lot of lamb, goat meat, and feta cheese also in modern-day Greek cuisine, because goats actually can live on these grassy plains and especially on the areas of the mountains themselves. But the farmland itself is still very important, because as we know, it's going to be very, very important to the growth of their culture. How much can they farm, and if they actually depend on farming or trading more? Well, speaking of that, going into it, something else you need to understand is that rainfall was not very reliable in ancient Greece. Actually, 1 out of every 4 years, they had crop failures, is what we predict using ancient, like, archaeological techniques. Not ancient archaeological techniques, using archaeological techniques on ancient data, right? So the thing about it, though, is also, if you don't have a lot of rainfall and you're literally bordered by 2 really large seas, the Ionian, which is the one over here, and the Aegean, the one right there, which is super ironic because you would think that this is the Ionian Sea, but it's not. That's the Ionian Sea. And the only reason I said you would think it was the Ionian Sea because, ironically enough, there was a city right here called Ionia Don't ask me why they went this way. But the thing about it, though, actually, I do know why they went this way. We'll talk about that later. But the Aegean Sea is right there on the east, and the Ionian Sea is right there on the west. But there are islands everywhere. And something that you need to go ahead and write down for me that's going to be really, really important in our study of ancient Greece is that these islands all had tons of natural harbors, okay? Write that down. Natural harbors. Lots of them, right? So the thing about it, though, is what is this telling us? They have bad farmland, but they got bunches of harbors. What it's telling us is that the Greeks, as they begin to develop, culturally, they're going to be much more dependent on trade than they are on farmland, right? Maybe not completely dependent on it. Of course, everybody's got a farm to survive and stay alive. But the thing about it is much more along the lines is that as the Mesopotamians began to grow wheat and grains and things like that, it will spread to some of the other areas outside of Mesopotamia and then impact some of the small settlements that actually start popping up in ancient Greece. So as the grains begin to spread and also as these natural harbors begin to grow, you're going to see the interaction between these primitive Greeks and then also some of the other more like stable civilizations that are already out there. Right around 7000 BC, we're going to see the growing of grain and actually the creation of some of the decent-sized settlements in the Neolithic period in ancient Greece. So going into it, though, as well, that you also need to know is, yes, the farmland is bad, and they are much more dependent on trade, but what kind of things would even grow in Greece if their farming is not very good? Now, these three things are 3 of the 4 staple crops, right? Now, ironically enough, I got 2 crops in one word, okay? So the only things that tend to grow well in ancient Greece is actually grains, grapes, and olives, okay? Now, look, funny thing about it, though, is the grapes and olives are going to be a big, big deal here in about 2 seconds, okay? And I'll explain that. But the grains, when you're talking about it, you're talking about wheat and barley, okay? Because every single ancient civilization depends on one foodstuff to be able to stay alive, and it's that of bread, right? Greeks need bread. Everybody needs bread. You need bread. I need bread. Everybody needs bread. Now, somebody who's probably gluten intolerant right now is probably just like, I can't have bread. Well, I'm sorry. I hate that for you. That's the worst because bread is fantastic, all right? So I love this stuff, and literally, since about, give or take, 10,000 BC, it's been the main sustenance form of food for most living human individuals for thousands of years, right? Literally, when we get all the way up into, the 1700s in, Europe, right? 1700s AD, when we're talking about the growth of absolute governments and then also leading into revolutionary periods, it's a lack of bread that actually made people angry at their governments. You know what I mean? So that's a really, really big deal. But going into it, though, grains are still really, really important. They provide a lot of dense calories and a lot of carbohydrates that can keep people alive. So the grains actually do grow really well in Greece when they actually got food packets from the Mesopotamians and they were actually able to grow them. Now, they also grew some other things like pulse plants, for example, like peas and chickpeas and stuff like that. They would grow as well. But grains are going to be really, really big because that's going to be the biggest thing they grow. Now, the second 2 biggest things they grow are those grapes and those olives, right? Which is going to be massively important to their trade and their growth of their agricultural systems in ancient Greece as well. Because grapes, they didn't eat the grapes off the vine, and olives were not grown for just eating olives, okay? Grapes and olives are not foodstuffs that you can survive off of in plenty, right? It's something you can live off of, but it's not going to keep you alive for a really long time. Grapes were actually pressed to get the juice out of them to make wine. And wine was massively important in ancient civilizations, and the Greeks had the stuff, and they made lots of it. So it actually made them very, very desirable as a trade partner, right? That's why the Phoenicians are going to show up one day, because they're going to want to trade with them to get their hands on some of this wine. Reason why is because if you add a little bit of wine to possibly tainted water, the alcohol in it will kill some of the bacteria, and actually Greeks and many other ancient civilizations drank wine most of the day. But they would actually heavily dilute it down so that alcohol didn't necessarily affect your ability, your coordination, or your mental status, right? So also, though, going forward as well, olives are going to be massively important because you would press the liquid out of them and you get olive oil, right? Olive oil could be used as a preservative, as a cooking method, and a lot of different other things, but mostly as a preservative, right? It was kind of like the earliest thing before vinegar was really, really big. Now, the thing about olives, though, as well, is olives and grapes grow crazy well in ancient Greece, right? And olives will become one of their staple crops, especially of ancient Athens, when we actually get to the development of archaic Athens. Olives grow so well in ancient Greece that their trees are everywhere, all over the place. And this right here is the oldest olive tree in Greece. It's actually on an island off the mainland area of Greece, and that bad boy, we believe, is 2,000 years old. That's right, I'm not kidding. There is an olive tree in Greece that when it was planted and living, Christ was alive. I want you to cook that down in your brain for a hot second. That's how well olives grow in Greece, okay? So the thing about it, though, going forward, that their geography, as you can see, is going to be very, very important because it's going to encourage trade. It's going to make it so they grow certain crops. It's also going to make it so their city-states are going to be very individual from one another, even though they do tend to speak the same language. Now we're starting off, though, with our very, very, very first couple of time periods, right? We've got to talk about the first couple of time periods before we can actually get into some really intense stuff. And the thing about it is we're going to be talking about the Neolithic Greeks first, right? And you got like 2 bullet points for it, okay? All you need to know about the Neolithic Greeks is that is our first signs of cultivating farmland and the growth of small civilizations. The earliest signs of civilizations in the Neolithic Greek period is just basically we have villages and settlements popping up. It's the earliest cities that show us evidence of farming, pottery, religion, and we have like several artifacts from the Neolithic period of Greece that actually show us that their culture was beginning to take root, right? For example, we believe that there was simple religious religious structures because of some idols that we have found there, and also we have found in their garbage piles a lot of really, really great stuff concerning pottery. Now, the big reason why Greeks were so well and adept at making pottery, and this is going to come up very, very big a little bit later on, we'll get into black and red figure pottery and how Greeks would then use pottery as an art form, and we'll get into why that is, but pottery and like vases and stuff like that were super important to Greeks because, think about it, all the stuff they traded was liquid, so it had to go inside of a pot, so we have tons of those artifacts laying around, okay? So but yes, that's the Neolithic period. That's really, really all you need to know about it. It basically just means that we have the earliest signs of civilization popping up in ancient Greece. But then we get into a really important one known as the early Bronze Age, right? Or the early Bronze Era. So something you have to understand really, really quick before we go any further is there's a reason why those 8 time periods are separated into 2 4x4 columns, right? So now, the thing about it is you have to understand is those first ones on the left-hand side, some of y'all might want to go ahead and take note of this, are actually a part of what's known as the Bronze Age Greeks, and the other ones on the other side, going Dark Ages, Archaic, Classical, Hellenistic, Dances at Charlie's House, right? Those are the Iron Age Greeks, okay? Now, the early Bronze period is going to start around 3200 BC, and it's mainly going to happen because of all that trade that they're doing, right? When the trade gets picked up and olive oil and wine become plentiful trade items that the earliest Greeks can actually get a hold of and move, the Hittites are going to actually trade with them and show that, or not the Hittites, but some of the Mesopotamians are going to trade with them because the Hittites actually did iron. That's a little bit later. So the biggest thing about it is some of the earliest Mesopotamians show them how to use bronze, right? And bronze is defined, okay, or the Bronze Era is defined by the introduction of forgeable metals, okay, to the early Greeks. Now, they wouldn't even call themselves Greeks yet because they hadn't really established the Greek language and stuff, but the thing about it is bronze was the main forgeable metal that they were using during this time period. And it was being used to make things like weaponry and also art as well. And we have several different pieces of artifacts and works and art and weapons and things like that that have been found in grave sites and then also in some different trash areas. And when I keep saying trash a lot, that's actually interesting, though, to me. Archaeologists, where they like to go look for things first because they can actually find a lot of evidence in the trash piles because you can see plants, organic matter that's been left behind, and also a lot of things that they throw away can at least be put back together a little bit so we can actually see what they actually used. The thing about it, though, is bronze is very important, but a lot of y'all probably don't even know what the heck bronze is, okay? So bronze, though, as a forgeable metal is very important. One, it's not something pure, okay? It doesn't come out of the dirt as bronze. It actually comes out of the dirt as 2 other metals, and it's mixed together in an alloy form, and it's copper and tin. And you can actually tell tin like your tin cans that you have in your pantry probably right now, and copper as in the things that we, of course, like coat money in. Like now, some of you are like, whoa, will we make it out of that? Not actually anymore. Most pennies that are actually made in the modern era in the United States are actually copper coating around a zinc core. But back in the day, we used to make actually like solid copper pennies and stuff like that. But also, copper tends to turn green and oxidize. And you can actually see the copper elements inside of bronze in a lot of these different items and a lot of these different artifacts. And it's also why the Statue of Liberty is, of course, turned green because she is made of copper, right? So going into it, though, as well, it's time to get serious, okay? And going into our next class, we're going to be getting very serious because we're going to be talking about the Minoans, the first large-scale civilization that pops up in ancient Greece starting in about 2000 BC. Now, on a scale of 1 to 10, I always like to ask kids, how much do you think that we know about these people? In the long run, how much do you think we know about them? And unfortunately, it's like a 2, all right? Maybe a 3 on a good day, right? We don't know a ton about the Minoans for sure, but we do know a lot of things about some of their artifacts and some of the things they've left behind, okay? And we've only even known they've existed since the early 1900s, late 1800s, because they were actually, their site was discovered originally by a Greek man, actually 2 decades before this other guy that even showed up. This is just one of those things that I think is important to bring up every now and again, and it's important to bring up and like stuff like that to give Greek people their due. But the thing about it is, who discovered Knossos, okay? Well, excuse me, the place where they actually did it. There's this man by the name of Minos Kalakairenos, okay? Now, the thing about it is he's not given a ton of credit for the discovery because he actually didn't do a lot of the archaeological work, right? When you actually, ask Google a lot of times who discovered the Minoans, a lot of times they'll refer to this man, okay? And his name is Sir Arthur Evans, okay? Sir Arthur Evans. Write that down. Sir Arthur Evans. Sir Arthur Evans is a British archaeologist that apparently did most of the archaeological work of this new culture that he discovered off of mainland Greece. And he is the one that names them, and he finds them on an island known as Crete, right off the coast. And what did he do? He did the archaeological work uncovering their place known as the Palace of Knossos, right? And so he is the one that named them that. A lot of it has a lot to do with mythological roots. But again, they discovered them on the island of Crete. Crete is spelled C-R-E-T-E, and he discovered the Palace of Knossos there. But we're going to go ahead and cut this flip off right there. We'll talk about all this different stuff, and we'll review it whenever I see y'all again. I hope y'all enjoy your Labor Day weekend. But I'll see y'all soon. Y'all have a good one.